this morning. Anthony Albanese is with me now. Thanks very much for your time.
Good to be with you, David.
You did say on 5AA that Penny Wong's Chief of Staff actually discussed specifically Barnaby Joyce when he spoke to his mate in New Zealand, the New Zealand Labor MP. Did he?
Well, that was wrong. I wasn't a party to that conversation. It was in the context of a discussion this morning on 5AA, a regular spot that I have with Christopher Pyne, and I said something that wasn't correct. I've corrected the record, as you know. Straight away after that, apparently it wasn't discussed specifically. It was a general discussion. But
they did discuss, as you say, the general matter around citizenship.
Well, they're mates.
Yeah, and presumably said to him, it'd be good to ask a question in the Parliament.
No. Apparently that was not discussed at all.
Just discussed the citizenship matter generally.
Yeah, as you would, like probably heaps of people in the pubs, at PNCs and at the sideline of footy games on the weekend.
So was it
we'll be discussing these sort of issues.
Was it inappropriate?
Well, it wasn't relevant. That's the point, David. The fact is that Minister Dunn...
Maybe or maybe not.
The New Zealand Internal Affairs Minister, who's the minister responsible here, has said in the Conservative government, has said that it was the inquiries from Fairfax that Fairfax made that caused the New Zealand government to make inquiries and then to make statements.
But the New Zealand Foreign Minister has said something different. The New Zealand Foreign Minister said, I think you'll find it was his question, the Labor MP's question, that prompted the need for the New Zealand High Commission in Australia to approach Barnaby Joyce to say, tell him about his situation.
Well, as you know, David, Barnaby Joyce actually answered questions about these issues and answered them in a way that we now know isn't true. He said that he checked. He told journalists, his office told journalists.
And that's a fair point. That's a fair point. But getting back to Labor's role, I mean, you know the government may have gone over the top in saying treason and treachery and so on. But was it inappropriate for a conversation with an MP, a member of the New Zealand Parliament?
Well, the big issue was inappropriate. Cory Bernardi, I saw on Sky News earlier today, speak about members of the government contacting members of the British government to say that he shouldn't be allowed to have meetings and have discussions with Conservative Party people prior to his visit to Britain. We have Malcolm Turnbull has in Spycatcher outlined in great detail him providing questions in the Parliament for Neil Kinnock. There are a whole range of issues here.
Is it okay or is that...
Well, the issue here, it's just not the issue. The issue here is Barnaby Joyce's eligibility to be Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and then the other issue is Julie Bishop as Foreign Minister behaving in such a chaotic way, questioning whether she could work with an incoming New Zealand Labor government if it's elected in 1 month's time, drawing into question whether she could have a cooperative relationship with our closest near neighbours there in New Zealand is quite bizarre.
Well, OK, but
the way that the government has handled this whole issue, David, this is the first time I've ever seen a government lose question time prior to the first question. When the Prime Minister came into the Parliament and gave a response to Yarra Council in Melbourne about the Australia Day issue. A quite extraordinary statement to take up question time.
You don't think the PM should speak up for Australia Day?
We saw before... It wasn't what it was about.
What was it about?
It was just about distracting and taking up some time of question time. The fact is there's no one in the Parliament from the Labor Party or the Liberal Party or the National Party is advocating changing the date of Australia Day. And if we're going to respond...
The Greens are, and councils...
if we're going to respond to, you know, what every sort of Tom, Dick and Harry says in some council in the National Parliament, then I would find that quite extraordinary.
OK,
but before question time...
New Zealand, sorry, getting back to the question of New Zealand, obviously Labor in New Zealand have said this was wrong, they shouldn't have done it. Penny Wong has even said
yes,
it was inappropriate. You agree?
Well, I agree with Penny Wong's statements on these issues. Absolutely.
So there shouldn't be this sort of conversation with the Kiwis about an internal matter.
Yeah, but it's not a big deal in terms of it's a distraction. It's an attempt by the government to distract from the real issues.
What should happen
and to
with
say,
this
look over here.
So the real issue is the citizenship of
And it
MPs.
needs to be dealt with. And Barnaby Joyce should do what Matt Canavan has done.
Resign.
Which is absolutely, and step aside whilst this is occurring. If it's the case that the High Court rules that there's no issues, of course he could return. But why is it that there's a different standard for Matt Canavan than there is for Barnaby Joyce? And the real concern here is it at all tenable for Barnaby Joyce to be acting Prime Minister when Malcolm Turnbull travels overseas? I mean, the government has to deal with this.
What do you say
and
to
instead of dealing with it, there've been all this look over here, look over there, and some bizarre performances in question
The
time.
government is still considering, as I understand it, whether to refer a bunch of Labor MPs to the High Court as well. Do you think that would be a good idea to provide some certainty?
Absolutely not. The idea that people will be referred by motions in the House of Reps or the Senate against their wishes, what Labor has in place is quite extraordinary. You think about the precedent there. The problem there is, David, that if you have a precedent whereby a government tries to use its majority, then any majority government can refer anybody who's not part of that majority to a court or question their legitimacy.
So if the government does
that's
this,
not the way that
Labor
it works.
will have a long memory.
That's not the way that it works. And I don't think the government will go there.
What about the idea the Greens and others have said about an audit of all MPs? Not the High Court dealing
Well,
but
we have
someone
one.
auditing.
We have one, David. It's called the nomination process. We go through in a great deal of detail all of the eligibility requirements for our MPs before they nominate.
Clearly not every party's been doing this.
Well, that's their problem, frankly. The rules are clear. It can be quite difficult. We do it every time as well.
But do you think the Australian people would like to see it cleared up once and for all with an audit?
Look, there's no doubt that if you were writing the Australian Constitution, you would do it in a different way, in my view, and indeed the Labor Party platform calls for reform of some of these issues.
Would you get rid of Section 44 applies?
Well, you'd have a debate about what the reform should be, and I'm not about to try and rewrite the Constitution
what do you think personally?
on your
Should
show.
dual citizens be allowed to sit in Parliament?
I think there's a question mark over it. I think that on the one hand, you want people who have absolute allegiance to Australia. I don't think that is too much to ask, that you have allegiance to Australia and only Australia.
You can do that with your oath or affirmation when you take the seat.
I think there are, where the grey areas come in from my perspective, more so relevant is someone who's a teacher or someone who works at a university, whether those sorts of issues of whether they get suspended or whether they have to, those issues are difficult, but they're there. We know what the rules are.
Yeah.
We all have to
when it comes to dual
apply
citizens,
to them.
though, I mean, you faced many questions yourself about your own citizenship status.
And I've answered them all,
Well,
David,
I was
as
going
you
to
know.
invite you to remind us once again that you are absolutely certain that there's no possibility of dual citizenship.
Absolutely, and you indeed have seen my documentation, David. The fact
your
is,
documentation where it says father basically has a blank space.
That's right.
And without reliving your personal story here, in some ways, you're kind of like the Jon Snow of Parliament for Game of Thrones fans.
Well, it's an interesting Game of Thrones analogy there. Perhaps politics in this place is a bit like Game of Thrones at the moment. But look, one of the reasons why I made the difficult decision, it must be said, to cooperate with Karen Middleton doing a biography is that I didn't want it just sort of slipped out in terms of my origins, which were basically that my mother had me by herself. She met someone and became pregnant. She came back to Australia and had me. I was due to be adopted out. And she made the difficult and courageous decision for a young Catholic woman in 1963 to keep me. And under those circumstances, though, in terms of my legal status, yes, there's a blank. There is no legal status of a parent, of anyone other than my mother, who then subsequently adopted the name.
And you're not the only Australian in that situation, but it is pretty rare.
And so my position is clearer than most into, and I didn't know the details of my father. I was told that he was dead, which was something that was about, I guess, providing the issue of legitimacy to my origins.
All right. Anthony Albanese, appreciate your time this afternoon and sharing that backstory as well for us once more. We'll talk soon. Thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Now, on the media